All right, so here we go. Month of July. Looking at the rainfall for the month of July, it was just slightly below average. So it represents the last 2 months actually where we have just slightly below average rainfall. Of course, as everybody is well aware, we had those excessive rains here in May, so the system is still trying to recover from those excessive rains. Overall, for July, as I said, it was about 95% of average here, just slightly below. The largest accumulation of rainfall was actually up here in the upper Kissimmee, with the least amount down here in the lower Kissimmee. So a lot of the lakes in the upper Kissimmee chain, Lake Kissimmee, Cypress, Hatchinaha, Toho, East Toho, and all the way up the chain have got an excessive amount of water in them at this point in time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So overall for the wet season, because the system is still recovering from those excessive rains back in May, we're still above average rainfall, some 133% above average rainfall so far for the wet season, starting back in May 14th up until now. So looking at those upper chains of lakes, you can see from that rain that primarily fell during the month of May and then again in July, some of those lakes, they rose up really fast and we had to increase discharge. In fact, we were doing maximum practical releases from East Lake Toho and Lake Toho, bringing all that water down into Lake Kissimmee over the past couple of weeks. And finally, as you can see, we made that turn, got the lakes under control and started them receding back down, both in East Toho and Toho. Lake Toho is just right about at its schedule. So as we start approaching that red line on the graph, the regulation schedule, then we'll back off on those discharges and the amount of water that we're bringing down into Kissimmee, Cypress, and Hatchinaha. So looking at Lake Kissimmee, you can see how it rose up, has sort of plateaued there for about a week or so, and then it was hit with those additional rains during the month of July and all the discharges that we were bringing down from the lakes to the north. Finally got it under control just recently this week. Along those lines, we had to increase discharges coming out of Lake Kissimmee, but we were able to moderate those discharges and not require as large of a discharge or a large of a increase as we normally would in recognition of all the issues that are occurring further downstream in Lake Okeechobee. So we're trying to hold back some of that water and moderate those flows coming out of Lake Kissimmee. And we're keeping that constant right now at about 5,000 CFS. We'll await what the future weeks bring us as far as rainfall amounts, and in particular paying close attention to where that rain falls, whether it's again up here in the northern portions of the district or is it in the central or southern portions of the district. But for right now, we're holding steady and trying to moderate those flows and maintain at least somewhat of a buffer in Lake Kissimmee, recognizing that we still have the heart of the wet season, the heart of the hurricane season still yet to come in the rest of August and in through September. So taking us down to Lake Okeechobee, as of this morning, Lake Okeechobee was at 14.45 feet. It had been steady. However, it has increased roughly 0.07 of a foot over the past week with some of that direct rainfall and the inflows coming down the Kissimmee River. As we all know, the Corps of Engineers has been making regulatory releases to the east and west coast. They're doing 1,170 CFS to the East Coast in a pulse release fashion. And what I mean by a pulse release, think of like a bell curve when you were back in school and teachers used to grade on a curve. It's simply a bell curve where you ramp up the first part and you peak out in the middle of the week. It's a 7-day release, but over that 7 days, you'll average 1,170 CFS. To the East Coast, they're doing about 3,000 CFS, and it's more of a constant, steady release as measured at S79 down at the estuary. So it takes into account any basin runoff. And I think Terry, during her presentation, will give a little bit more information on the splits on how much is actually coming from Lake Okeechobee and making its way to the estuaries. So ignore this number up here. As you can see, it's a couple days older, but as of this morning, the lake is, as I said, at 14.45, so it's risen a little bit since this graphic was prepared, but overall what we're following is this red line for 2018. You can see how it had been receding, but with some of those rains, it sort of plateaued and it's been holding steady, only slightly increasing over the past couple weeks. Looking at 2016, you can see we're just slightly below where we were this time of year for 2016. And in 2017, which is this green trace down here, we're well above where we were in 2017. Looking at the other portions of the system, Conservation Area 1 up here in the top right-hand corner, you can see it is now back at its regulation schedule. It has been, we're following that regulation schedule up to its winter pool up here, so you'll see stages in Conservation Area 1 start rising over the coming weeks. Area 2 is well above its regulation schedule, which is this red line down here. However, if you'll recall, the Corps of Engineers approved another deviation for this year to the regulation schedule, and that is what is represented by this line. With some of those rains in the month of July, it did briefly go back above its deviation schedule line, but is now slightly below that line. As a result of it rising from those rains, the Corps of Engineers did open the S11 structures early last week, I want to say. And right now, the Corps of Engineers is moving about 1,800 CFS from Area 2 down into Area 3 down here. So that takes us to Area 3 over here on the left-hand side. You can see some of that recent rainfall had been making a steady recession. Some of the recent rains bumped it up just a little bit. But once again, it has resumed that recession in spite of the additional water that's coming in from Area 2. One key thing to be aware of, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in another slide later on, is this darker line at the top of the schedule. That is the emergency high water line that you've heard us talk about in the past, and you can see from those excessive rains back in May, conservation area was driven up above that line. That constituted all the emergency actions, emergency operations, and led to the emergency orders issued by both the Department of Environmental Protection as well as the governor. Since then, we've been able to bring it below that line, but of significance is this other line here, which is also what we call just an action line, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means and what significance it holds here shortly. So looking at the southern portion of the system, all of the S12s, A, B, C, and D are currently open and moving water from Conservation Area 3 down into Everglades National Park. We're moving somewhere on the order of 1,200 cubic feet per second of water through the S12 structures. In addition to that, there's the S333 structure that sits right about there that moves water into the L29 canal. So of significance since the last board update in the water conditions report, at that point in time when Akeem presented to you, the L29 canal was being operated at 8.0 feet. Since that time, as a result of the Corps of Engineers completing some of the construction efforts, or a portion of those construction efforts down here along the South Dade conveyance system in the detention areas as part of the South Dade project, we have been able to raise the L29 canal from 8.0 up to 8.3. So as a result, that S333 structure is currently discharging on the order of 1,200 CFS as well into the L29. So combined between the S12s and the 333 structure, we're moving somewhere on the order of 2,500 CFS out of Water Conservation Area 3A, either directly into the park or into the L29, moving under Tamiami Trail and flowing into Northeast Shark River Slough. So as I mentioned, the two emergency orders that everybody is well aware of. So in looking at the overall operations and just from a routine course of business, as I've said several times in the past, there's only a limited number of outlets from the conservation areas to tide through C51, through the Hillsborough, North New River, through some of the canals in Broward County here, as well as the Miami River to the bottom, and of course we're all well aware of the structures to the south that move water out of the conservation areas. So since the emergency and there was excessive rains back in May, we have been making all practical efforts to move water through those normal routes. In addition to that, as Akeem presented last month, we have, under the authority granted to us in the governor's actions as well as the Department of Environmental Protection through those emergency orders, we've been able to set up temporary pumps in these locations on the dots here on the map. So there's some pumps moving water from area 2A back into 1 that we can then move out of the Hillsborough Canal. There's some temporary pumps located down here to move water out of 3A into 3B. Some pumps on the west side along the L28, again to move water out of 3A into the L28. Just recently, there were some pumps, so an update from what has changed over the last month. We were able to set up and install 4 temporary pumps located right here at the 355B structure to move water out of area 3B into the L29. Those pumps had been doing on the order of 200 to 300 CFS in total. Just recently, as of actually yesterday afternoon, we had to secure one of those pumping units for lack of water. So when you're talking about pumping, you need water to maintain the pump operations, otherwise the pump starts cavitating, and that's not a good thing. So you may think that it's bad that we had to turn off the pump, but if you look at the other side of the coin, it's good that we had to turn off the pump because it means water levels are coming down. In the sense that you didn't have enough water to be able to supply the pumps, and water levels have been receding. Similar situation occurred to one of the temporary pumps located over here on the west side of the water conservation area. We had to secure its pumping because water levels had been coming down, as I showed you in that prior graphic, and the pump wasn't getting enough water. So we'll wait for some of the water that's stacked up in the northern portions of the conservation area to then make its way back down to the southern portions of the conservation area, and then we can reinitiate pumping at both of those 2 locations for those 1 pump that had been secured. So, as I talked about, as Conservation Area 3A is drying down and receding, we are roughly 6/100ths of a foot away from that action line that I showed back on the prior graphic here, right there. So we're just barely above it, 6/100ths of a foot. So I would reasonably expect that tomorrow or sometime over the weekend we would actually cross that line. So what that then allows us to do is, and why it's significant, is then there's another pump station located right here, the S356 pump station. Once we cross that line, we have every intention of being able to turn on that pump station and being able to manage a lot of the water that is in the L31 North Canal right here that has been induced from the seepage coming out of Everglades National Park. As I talked about, we've got some 2,500 CFS flowing from the park directly from 3A, plus the 200 or 300 from the temporary pumps coming out of 3B. All of that water is flowing into the park, into Northeast Shark River Slough. Therefore, levels within the park have come up, and as a result, it's inducing seepage to the east, because that's the preferential path for that groundwater movement. So once we get that 6/100ths of a foot that I'm looking for over the next day or two, we'll be able to turn on the S356 pump station and start operating it as it was intended, as it was envisioned under the Modified Waters project. So with that, looking to the future, for the rest of August, as you can see there on the left-hand side, there's equal chances of either normal, above normal, or below normal rainfall. As we progress through the month of November, that pretty much stays the same. What I'll draw your attention to is this graphic all the way over here on the right-hand side for the December through February outlook or forecast. Right now, what we see happening is an El Nino forming out in the Pacific. The good side of that is it tends to suppress hurricane activity in the Caribbean and the Atlantic here for the state of Florida. So that's a good thing. But it also means there's a higher likelihood and a higher potential for above average rainfall during the dry season. If you recall that back in 2016, that emergency was precipitated by excessive rainfall during the dry season that set up another higher than normal wet season. So this has been the pattern for essentially the last 3 years in a row, whether we get the excessive rain in the dry season or we get a big gusher right at the beginning of the wet season in June. It sets up that beginning of the wet season that has led to a lot of the emergencies that we've seen over the last 3 years. So I just wanted to point that out and draw to your attention. We may be in for an above average dry season. So as we look at water levels and all the emergency operations that we're currently employing, trying to get water out and move water south, we need to be cognizant of what the future may hold and how much rain that may be getting. One other additional thing that I forgot to mention earlier back here when we talk about moving water south. In addition to those operations and the increase in the elevations in the L29 down here, we are continuing to move about 2,500 CFS out of Lake Okeechobee through the EAA into the A1 FEB and treated in STA 3, 4, and STA 2, and moving that water south down through the system as we've been able to make room in the conservation area for that water with all of the emergency operations that we've been employing. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.